Here we are to talk about the last chapter in the book, Angela, a Woman of Hope, in dialogue with her times. And you know, that's really a very important topic for right now, because here we are, women in dialogue with our times, and hopefully as women of hope. When I talked to Angela about this, I've really talked to her a lot. And sometimes she talks back to me, but not always. But when I try to read her comments, as it were, in her writings, and I don't know if you'll have this book or not, but all of her writings are in this book. And so I went through the book countless times, trying to see what is she about and what is she talking about and what are her values. What was she saying to the people who were following her? First of all, to set her in her own times, they are very similar to ours. They were similar to ours. The church was in crisis. I mean, things look bad now, but if we made it through that period without the church falling apart, we can make it through anything. And were just being formed. Italy was not a nation. It was a group of city-states. You were either Milanese or Venetian or whatever province. They're provinces now, but whatever they were called at the time. And they did not get along very well. So there were always fights going on. Political, but also violence. A lot of people were killed. And then on top of that, they kept talking about the French coming in, or the Spanish. So they either had the French disease or the Spanish disease, all of which were, of course, venereal diseases, and the people did not know how to take care of them. So a lot of people died unnecessarily. So there were a lot of sick people. And there was also the same division in society as today. I mean, they were very, very wealthy people. Sometimes today when I see television and I see somebody's house and it goes on for acres, and I think, glory be to God, why are they living in such a huge place? But it goes on today, and it certainly went on in Angela's time. There was a society division, like if you were part of the aristocracy, you had everything you could possibly want. And if you were not, you had hardly anything. There was not really a middle class to speak of, although there were, craftsmen and laborers and builders and what have you. But by and large, you were either very wealthy or very poor. And for the most part, I think, even the very wealthy were pretty uneducated. Many people did not read. And amazingly, Angela learned how to read as a child. Now, this is after the invention of the printing press, but people did not ordinarily have libraries in their homes. But Angela's family did. Her father had the Bible, and he had the Lives of the Saints. So that's what she grew up on. He read to the family, and obviously she learned to read from him. So, in many ways, it's kind of like things are today. There are many, many people, as you know, who don't know how to read. It amazes me when I read about people who can't read and can't even sign their names. They can't write. So that's a similarity also. So then I say to Angela, okay, how'd you deal with that? What did you do? And so I look at her life to see what she did. She grew up in a loving atmosphere, in a family that was very strong. Her mother and father. She had an older brother and an older sister and a young brother. She only had one sister. And they lived, it's interesting, in the little town of Desenzano, where we know she was born, there's I'd call it an apartment complex, but I don't know what they called it. Anyway, they were apartments, and the family lived, there's a marker on the wall outside that says, tradition says she was born in such and such apartment. There's a number there. But we don't know if she really lived there or not. I like to give it the benefit of the doubt. So that's where she started. But somewhere along the line, their father moved them to a rural area. It's called La Grezza. It isn't really a town. It's like a gathering of farmhouses. They're not even all close together. And the place that we, as Ursans, kind of claim as her space is a fairly large, I don't know what to call it. To grace it with a term, apartment complex would be, a great exaggeration. Because the area that was thought to be their home was one room on the first floor and one room on the second floor. And as I got to know the area, the other places along there are like that too. There's just ground floor and an upper floor. At one time, one area was the chapel or the Church of St. Angela Merici, after she was dead long ago. But this one little area, because that's the first place we met for Mass. Later, they have built a very large, beautiful church, the only new church I ever saw while I was there. And now that, I don't know what they're doing with that area now. Anyway, so she grew up in this little house. I'd like to call it a house. And on the first floor was a fireplace, large fireplace, and a well, which always surprised me that it was inside. So they had running water and they had heat. And because the room was so small, I guess it didn't take a lot to heat it, but the floor was dirt, not carpeted or anything like that. It was just a dirt floor. On the second floor was one room, and that was the bedroom. And a mat is on the floor. People make such a big deal about that. Oh, she slept on a mat. Well, everybody did. So it wasn't, at least everybody in that financial area space. So that's where she grew up, and her father had a farm, and the farms were about as extensive as a square block. So we're talking small. And I don't know what he grew. Probably wheat. I don't know, some other grain that they used. And he had a vineyard, but the vineyards were all together, and each farmer had a section that was his part of the vineyard. And there was a sidewalk all around it. So that's where she grew up. In the town of Desenzano, there's a church, and I can't remember the name of it. It's very nice, but it's very old. And the only thing that people claim was there when she was there was the baptismal font. And we don't know if that's the truth or not, but we like that. We have a picture of it in our house. So she grew up there, was educated by her parents. Her father's name was John. We don't know what her mother's name was, and we don't know the names of her brothers and her sister. Though she was very close to them, particularly to her sister. Now, as happened in those days, there was we call it a plague. I don't know what we would call it today, an epidemic, And so I see on television that sometimes, whole towns are wiped out when something goes through that people don't know the cure for. That's what happened in Angela's area. A lot of people died, including her sister, whom she loved dearly. Not at the same time, but around the same time. Both parents died and her older brother. So that left Angela and her younger brother. Now, you look at the stories on TV about what goes on at the southern border, and you see how people are dying uselessly because people don't have what they need to take care of themselves. So that's similar to our time. Also, the lack of understanding and trust when it comes to who's in charge, that restlessness and fear was there. So I asked Angela, what kept you from being afraid? How did you manage all of that? When your parents died, how did you manage that? She became the landowner because her brother was older and her sister, and they died. So she was, in a way, she was in charge of the farm. Well, there's all kinds of disagreement about how old she was when all this happened. But apparently, she thought it was a good thing. Her aunt and uncle, who lived in another town not too far away, she went to live with them. And I assume her little brother went with her, though no mention is ever made of him. So she lived with her aunt and uncle. Now, that happens today. Children are bereaved. And so we know what that looks like and what that feels like to be in a grief situation. So her aunt and uncle were very good to her. She was another person to help take care of things. They were not farmers. I don't know what, their name was Biancosi. I don't know what they did to make a living, but apparently they were quite wealthy. So she lived into a different situation. We've seen that happen too. Sometimes children are orphaned and they move to a place that's good for them. And so they learn more about the world than they had known before. Because Desenzano was a very tiny place. It still is, actually. So you don't get a lot of exposure to many things in a little place like that. But they moved to Selo, which is the name of the town where the Biancosis lived. It too was a lake town, but wealthier. And so she grew up in a society that she had not had before. And fortunately, yes, for all of us, she met the Franciscans. The Franciscans had a friary on an island just off of Selo. This is all Lake Garda, that's the biggest lake in Italy. When I saw it, I don't know if I was expecting to see one of the Great Lakes, because they kept saying it's the biggest one in Italy. Well, it's about maybe a third of the size of one of the Great Lakes. But it's very important because it extends up into Austria. And so you still have people who speak German and Italian and all that in that area, because there was a lake. It was a lot of merchants. They still do. So instead of, I don't know if they probably call them on the phone now, but instead, the ships went back and forth and they did their trading that way. That exposed her to something new. And you know what it feels like when you go into something new. That's a common experience. I don't know if you experienced that when you got a new job. I bet you did.
I did.
And you did too, I bet. It changes everything. You change one element and the whole thing shifts. So, but fortunately, she met the Franciscans and took to their spirituality like fish to water. She absorbed from them or learned from them simplicity and hope and joy. Those are all characteristics of the Franciscan charism. Simplicity and joy and hope. And those were already in her, but they nurtured it so that she became a person of great joy and great hope and an intelligence that was broad for a woman in her circumstances, because the Franciscans are missionaries. And so, in a way, she became that also. Now, I compare that, those are so many common experiences. It took me a long time to realize that she was a businesswoman, because part of being a landowner and leasing her land to other farmers when she went to live with her uncle and aunt, she had to go back and collect the rent. Which that's a different kind of category. I had a hard time, adjusting to that. I never thought of her as a businesswoman, but there are records, and so this is not made up. There are records in Desenzano about whoever was farming, that she came and collected their rent every year. So that's very exciting to me. Because, sometimes you're put in a situation where you would never do something, except something happens and you have to pick up something to do that you wouldn't ordinarily do. And I kind of think it must have been like that for her. Who would have thought, as she was a little kid running around in Desenzano, that she was going to be a businesswoman? So she was a savvy person. Okay, so we put all those together. She was smart. She knew how to read. She was a businesswoman, and she was a woman full of hope in a situation and at times that looked pretty hopeless. Well, so I look at us and I think we're in that same situation. We are living in a very dark period of history for our own country, but also for the world. We know a whole lot more about the rest of the world than Angela did, but we also know the intimacy of what goes on in our own families, what goes in our neighborhood. We recently, a young man has moved in next door to us from Guatemala. We don't know anything about him, and we're not going to find out whether or not he's illegal or illegal. Doesn't matter to us. He has moved in, and his fiancée is going to move in soon. That's wonderful. A new world is going to move in next door to us. The neighbors just moved out from there who were Muslim. That was an entirely different experience for us. We learned to recognize which children had on which jihad and who the ranking of the girls and the mother and father. It was like our world got enlarged there too, because I would never have thought I would be talking to a woman who was a teacher of the Quran. And so she said she would tell us things. She never got around to it before she left, but I always wanted to listen to her talk about Islam. So at Angela's time, the Christians were fighting the Islam people. Anyway, I keep trying to draw parallels, because right now what our world needs is hope. In a way, you can't love unless there's hope. And I know that faith is the basis of our lives, but hope is so important to faith. How could you have hope if you don't have faith? And how can you have faith if you don't have hope? So the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, they go together. And you can hardly take one out without disturbing the others. So she was a woman of hope. Now, how do we know that? Because people flocked to her. You don't go to somebody, well, maybe you have to, who's doom and gloom all the time. Because that's painting a picture of reality that has not known Christ, has not known the risen Christ. But we have, as Christians, we know the risen Christ. Angela never talked about theological issues like the risen Christ. She doesn't ever use that title. She speaks of the Lord, of divine majesty, shepherd. She has various names for God, but they're all shot through with hope. And so people went to her because they needed hope, just like we need hope. That's why I think it's so exciting to be a woman today. For one thing, I think women are standing on the cusp of a whole new world. When I look at the women in Congress, it's like, this never happened before. So there's something moving. It's painful. Women keep bumping their heads on the glass ceiling, as we saw with the players last week who won the cup. Tell me, the soccer team, who don't get anywhere near the pay that men do. People are beginning to realize that and making a fuss about it. Equal pay, we're learning to say, to women who have reached the top of their profession more than once. 4 times they've done it. But it also happens like in other areas of living, like medicine. So many of our best doctors and scientists are women. Finally, it's like women have brains, for God's sake. You never would have known it. I taught girls for many years, and I met some of the brightest people I've ever met. I taught boys for a while too, but that was a different story. The ones who were smart were really smart, and smart aleck along with it. But the women, the young women that I've met in my teaching career, some of them were just outstanding scholars who loved learning. And then you look at our community, how many graduates of our schools are top positions. They're judges, doctors. So something is happening that I think is really good. And I think Angela would fit in right away, because the people she drew to her were women. And she had to have some men in there because some things couldn't be legalized unless the man was the lawyer or whatever. But they held a very remote responsibility in the company. Although they were all women, which is remarkable. She didn't have anybody. She wrote her own rule, which also is very unusual, because for the most part, women congregations in the church today, their rules are written by men, which is really, isn't that interesting? Anyway, she wrote her own rule, and it was never suppressed, although when the company became an order, which was not done to them by the church. It was done by a woman in Paris who wanted to start a Carmel. And so she wanted them to have this position in the church that was important. So she gathered these women together. They objected to that, and they said, no, we have to have contact with the world, because that's how Angela was. So they were allowed to bring girls into the monastery. But that's when we picked up the whole monastic baggage, that's the word. We became nuns, and we had to pray the divine office and wear a habit and the whole thing, go behind cloister walls. It took us a long time to come out of that. That came along with Vatican Council II. But who were the people who led that movement? Women. And so who taught most children? Women. Even professors. We had sisters in the community who were doctors. They taught science. We had one sister who wrote books about scientific methods, and another who wrote a history book. So it's like, women have been very much in the forefront in education in particular, but not necessarily. The first woman pharmacist in the United States was an Ursuline. People don't know that. There's this traveling display. I think it has found a permanent home now, but for a while they were taking it around the country to show, and there's her microscope. I just found that, chilling somehow, to know that in the backwoods of New Orleans, had to have been way before the Civil War, probably before the War of 1812. There were Ursulines there, and one of them was a pharmacist. Remarkable. Anyway, so those were exciting times, and these are exciting times. And Angela was like one of those who helped to ignite it. She's sometimes recognized as that, and there are books written about the history of religious life, women, and she's always got a special chapter because she was different, the way she went about organizing her group. So she was in dialogue with her times, that's for sure. She knew what was going on in her world, and it was a lot larger than Desenzano. It was a lot larger than the city of Milan, because she had been to the Holy Land. and all those little other places around. She'd been to Venice. She'd been to Milan more than once. So there you go. She was a woman of the world. And so she was in dialogue with her times. And I think that's what we are now. Otherwise, why are you interested in her? That's how I want to conclude this whole discussion. I mean, we've been together for quite a while through these, not everybody at the same time, but you know a whole lot about her and about her history. Do you have an impression of her that you find life-giving or not life-giving?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I think that everything that you just talked about and that I see in the Ursuline sisters is that striving to make the world a better place and risking, taking a chance, being vulnerable to take those risks out in the world. And I know last week when we did our little meeting with the sisters, hearing all the places, all of the pathways. It wasn't one straight pathway. And I think that is inspiring about Angela too. That's not one straight pathway. But that idea that we are called to go out into this world, that it can be a very scary place, and to bring it hope, and I think that is super inspiring, because that's what we try to do every day, I hope.
Yes, I think so too. That's one reason that I have such respect for associates, because you have a different kind of relationship to the world than the sisters do. And then Jenny is the director of the Angela Merici Center for Spirituality. So you get an entirely different, broader contact with the world and the spirituality of Angela.
I mean, the thing that I think that draws me to Angela is how she was true to herself, that she had opportunities to go off and like the invitation. My understanding is the invitation from the Pope.
Yes.
To come to Rome and do what she was doing in Brescia or
Brescia by that time.
Yeah, to do that in Rome. And she didn't say right to the Pope's face no. She skipped out in the middle of the night.
That's right.
She knew what was true for her.
That's right. That's right.
She knew what was right for her. I'm just wondering, Martha, if you could, I've wondered, with everything that's going on in the church today, and I hear and I know people who've just taken their ball and bat and gone elsewhere, who've been very disillusioned and very hurt, people who've been very wounded. What would Angela say? Do you have any sense of that, of what she would say about the church and how to be faithful?
That's a good question. Yes, I've thought about that. I've asked her about that. There's never been a reform that has lasted, that has not come from within. So I can leave my order, not at my age, but I could leave the church. But then how could I speak to it? And I think there are many people who, for other reasons, have left the church, and I don't dispute that. And if that's what they have come to understand and discerned that that's what they should do, they have to be true to that. But it's going to be very hard for them to reform the church, because it's okay to throw stones when you're outside of the glass house. But if you're within it, you don't throw stones, you remake it. And I see signs of that also happening. People keep talking. They may speak angrily or softly, but there's change that's happening, I think, in the church. The church moves very slowly. So it's happening very slowly. But you know that the Holy Father recently has appointed lay women as the head of some of the dicasteries. Well, that's really different. That maybe people don't even grasp that, because there have always been clerics at the heads of those offices, the castries within the curia. Now they're women. Some of them, God forbid, they're lay women. Probably they're married, I don't know what that makes. So there's that. Once it starts happening at that place in the church, then it will spread out, hopefully, that just like the young women in Congress are making a lot of waves. They couldn't have done that unless they were within the structure itself. So that's where I find hope there. I'll never live to see the end of that, but you probably won't either, right? It's not going to happen real soon. There's this joke about, wanting to see the Holy Father, and she'll have her husband with her. But that's way in the future. There's this little story I love to tell about Saint Martha, who, we always see that story between Martha and Mary. But there was another meeting Martha had with Jesus when her brother Lazarus had died. So she goes out first to see Jesus. She's the first one who goes out. I could just see her standing there shaking her finger at him. If you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And he didn't say anything. And she said, yes, he will rise again at the last day. And Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will never die. Do you believe that? What a question. Do you believe that? And she says, yes, Lord, I have come to believe that you are the Christ. Now I love that because that's a progression. I have come to believe. It's not like I didn't jump on the bandwagon right away. I have come to believe that you are the Christ. When Peter said that, Jesus made him the Pope. Practically the same words. I just chuckle about that. But Jesus says to Martha, where have you laid him? So they quickly changed the subject. But she says that's wonderful. I have come to believe that you are the Christ. It's kind of like, when have I come to believe that Jesus is Lord? When was that? And is that a process? I mean, we're always in that process of coming to know Jesus more deeply as the Lord, the risen Christ. Well, I think women are doing that too. And they're coming, it's coming from within. I always think every parent should be canonized. A lot of people who aren't mothers don't or should be canonized too. But every time I look at especially young married couples who have babies, who have to get up at all hours of the day and night and watch over their children, who have become the center. They're definitely not self-centered, the parents aren't. They can't afford to be. They got to watch that child grow up. Now, if that is not a holy reality, I don't know what is. Because when we can come out of ourselves and love another, then we are truly coming to know God. In Les Mis, the opera, there's a song that, I forget who sings it, to love another person is to see the face of God. That is so beautiful and so true. So that's why I think parents should all be canonized. And we all know they love their children. Well, not all parents do, but all good parents love their children. It means they came out of themselves, so they see the face of God in their children. They never say it that way, I don't think, but that's the reality.
I think that's what happens with Angela. She calls the women who came to her my daughters.
Yes.
A
relationship.
Yeah, that like a good parent, she came out of herself.
Yes.
And loved them.
Yes, it's amazing.
Yeah.
But when you know you're loved, you're attracted to that.
Right.
And that's a sign of hope. How can I not hope if I know that I'm truly loved?
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martha.
The whole thing has come full circle now. I think we end kind of where we started with women. And so, thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Insightful.
And